Mr. Angus Robertson.
The US government has just said that, and I quote, systematic endemic problems in Saudi Arabia's targeting drove the US decision to halt a future weapons sale involving precision-guided munitions. The Saudis have UK-supplied precision-guided Paveway 4 missiles. They're made in Scotland. The UK has licensed £3.3 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia since the beginning of the bombing campaign. What will it take for the UK to adopt an ethical foreign policy when it comes to Yemen?
Well, as the right honourable gentleman knows, the intervention in Yemen is a UN-backed intervention. As I've said previously, where there are allegations of breaches of international humanitarian law, then we require those to be properly investigated. We do have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. The security of the Gulf is important to us, and I would simply also remind the right honourable gentleman that actually Saudi intelligence, the counter-terrorism links we have with Saudi Arabia, the intelligence we get from Saudi Arabia has saved potentially hundreds of lives here in the UK.
What a farrago of nonsense from Theresa May there. And all of this liberal wailing about eastern Aleppo. The same things, much more indiscriminate attacks are being carried out with British weaponry in Yemen. And don't forget, both in Yemen and Bahrain, Saudi Arabia has crossed international borders to carry out these attacks. What's going on in Syria is an internal affair, apart from the foreign terrorists that have been infiltrated by us through Jordan and Turkey. And the hypocrisy stinks to heaven, and the blood of millions is on the hands of successive British governments, and they have the cheek to turn around and accuse others who are trying to defend themselves of being in the wrong. Ultimately, I think what's going on here is we're accusing others of what we ourselves are doing.
OK, Russia not only apparently hacked Hillary Clinton and her chief of staff's emails, but also hacked the US presidential elections too. Is there any evidence for this, or is this fake news?
Well, if you're asking me, I'd say there's no evidence for it. It's a bit like the doping scandal. It's a bit like stuff in eastern Aleppo. What we are dealing with is the drumbeat, drum, 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 of warmongering. That's what we're listening to. Warmongering people, mongering their wars.
Well, Craig Murray has talked about this, the former ambassador. I spoke to him earlier today, and he said that he's been advised by WikiLeaks he better not say anything much more about it.
Well, that's because he was involved in the actual leak, and it was a leak. It's not a hack. It's a leak. The person who leaked the information about the rigging of the Democratic primaries by the Clinton campaign was a fed-up Bernie Sanders supporter. It wasn't the Russians, and it wasn't a hack.
And so he was leaking it because he could see corruption going on within the Democratic National Convention, the National Party, the Democrat Party. And so he said, well, look, because it's so corrupt in the Democrat Party, I think that the public needs to see some of this.
Indeed, and Craig Murray actually flew to the US to receive the documents.
I seem to remember
they weren't transmitted by email at all.
I seem to remember that we actually covered the story where he was blocked at the airport. He was told he wasn't allowed to go to the US, and then he managed to get permission to go. So that may have been when that was all taking place.
Indeed. And this is all part of a manipulation.
Anyway, his piece on his brilliant, superb blog, Craig Murray's blog, is really one of the best in the country, in the world, really. He said he's watched incredulous as the CIA's blatant lie has grown and grown as a media story. Blatant because the CIA has made no attempt whatsoever to substantiate it. There is no Russian involvement in the leaks of emails showing Clinton's corruption. Yes, this rubbish has been the lead today in the Washington Post in the US, and the Guardian in Britain was also the lead item on the BBC main news. I suspect it is me leading the US broadcast news also. A little simple logic demolishes the CIA's claims. They claim they know the individuals involved, yet under Obama the USA has been absolutely ruthless in its persecution of whistleblowers and its pursuit of foreign hackers through extradition. We're supposed to believe that the most vital instance imaginable, an attempt by a foreign power to destabilise the US election, even though the CIA knows who the individuals are, nobody's going to be arrested, nobody's going to be extradited, or, if in Russia, made subject to yet more banking and other restrictions against Russian individuals. Plainly, it stinks. The anonymous source claims of we know who it was the Russians, are beneath contempt.
Well, that's right. We're in a post-truth world, and not because of shows like this and the internet. It's because Western governments take taxpayers' money and set up things like the white helmets, and the CIA has been a big boondoggle for years, and then they come up with all sorts of lies and fibs to bend the minds of the population to try and herd them along like sheep in certain directions. And to call that democracy is stretching the use of language.
Also, of course, it's John Brennan that's the director of the CIA, and Donald Trump has removed him. He's going to be out in January, so it may be that this is a last blast from him.
Well, what's extraordinary is we see, I think what we've got is a fight going on at the top of the intelligence community in the US and in the establishment. And, of course, in Syria, this has extremely important consequences.
Is it fair for the Western media, the whole of the London media, to report a story where the CIA contact them? They say, well, we know it's true, but we can't tell you, and we can't give you any evidence. We can't actually flesh this out. Otherwise, that would compromise national security.
Well, all I can say is in 2017, as we soon will be in, if they think that they can just huff and puff and say CIA says it's true but we can't tell you and we're to be trusted, I think that the people of the world should be able to see through that straight away. The CIA is an organised lying machine. It always has been. It still is.
Okay,
and therefore, when they say something, you can pretty much guarantee that it's not true.
I'll put a link to Craig Murray's article, The CIA's Absence of Conviction, on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But one of the people who's spoken out about this just a couple of days ago is President Obama himself.
There is no doubt that when any foreign government tries to impact the integrity of our elections, that we need to take action, and we will, at a time and place of our own choosing. Some of it may be explicit and publicized, some of it may not be. But Mr. Putin is well aware of my feelings about this because I spoke to him directly about it.
Yeah, they've also said that Putin was directly involved in the hack. And, of course, they've been threatening to carry out cyber attacks on Russia, and they've been hinting that nasty consequences might happen. Accidents can happen, and then an accident did happen, which you mentioned earlier in the show. 5 top Russian banks were attempted to be taken down by a mysterious hacker. Now, who could that be?
This is was a story on actually Thursday the 10th of November last month. Simon Robb for metro.co.uk. At least 5 of Russia's largest banks targeted in a massive cyber attack using 24,000 computers, one of the security giants confirmed. Country's largest state-controlled Sberbank said it was targeted but managed to neutralise it. Moscow-based internet security giant Kaspersky said hackers tapped into thousands of devices to target the websites of at least 5 well-known financial institutions. In the top 10, the banks were targeted throughout Thursday, lasting almost 12 hours. A system called DDoS, Distributed Denial of Service, was used to flood bank servers. In the attacks, more than 660,000 requests were sent per second by hijacking more than 24,000 devices in 30 countries. It's believed botnets, also known as the zombie army, were used to accomplish this. Botnets are devices like CCTV and digital video recorders are used to forward transmissions without the owner's knowledge. So this came actually around about a week after the Russians warned that the West was planning something like this, and then it actually happened. Incredible.
Although hardly reported at all in the Western media. You'd have thought it would have been top of the news of five Russian banks. Somebody's trying to hack them down. But it reported in Computer News is the only place I found the information.
Well, it was
certainly not the BBC.
It was there in the Metro, and one wonders whether some of the other mainstream medias were deliberately keeping that one out of the spotlight.
Well, indeed,
because this whole thing
raises questions.
This whole thing of cyber attacks has been talked about. First, it was talked about by Jens Stoltenberg, who's the NATO Secretary General, then by Hillary Clinton, then by Theresa May, I think it was, over here, saying, well, look, if the Russians do some sort of hack attack, we may have to retaliate with real force.
Yes, or with cyber force. And, of course, we know that the Israelis and the Western powers, including the US and Britain, carried out the Stuxnet attack on Iran, which was attempting to try and knock out their nuclear program. And then, of course, the Stuxnet virus escaped and helped to make Fukushima the mess that it still is. And that's not reported, is it?
And
let's not even talk about
on
that.
BBC 5 Live today, they did do a report on this story, which is where I got that Obama clip from. And also they spoke to Sir Andrew Wood, who's a former British ambassador to Moscow, to Russia.
I don't see how Donald Trump could not have known something. I think that's almost impossible. And what he actually said was to Hillary Clinton in the debates, you can't prove it, essentially. Those weren't his words, but he's just saying you don't know. He never said, this is serious, it must be investigated.
I think it's just... there's no evidence whatsoever that Trump was in cahoots with Putin to hack the US election. Don't forget, there are two aspects to this. One is the leaks of the emails which showed Clinton had rigged the Democratic primaries, and that Podesta and others, and also, of course, that they'd been supporting ISIS and so on. That's all. Nobody disputes what was in the emails. And they're saying that it affected the election and the Russians must have done it. But what's in the emails, as Putin pointed out, is the important part, which is that they were supporting ISIS. They were, that Saudi Arabia did fund the Clinton campaign and the Clinton Foundation, and that they had rigged the Democratic primary, and she shouldn't really have been the electoral candidate. Now, all of that is just they don't dispute any of that. They just say, oh, well, the information was secret and shouldn't have been leaked. But it was, as Craig Murray's pointed out, it wasn't hacked. It was a leak. And then, of course, they're now saying that they hacked the actual election itself, which I find a bit strange, because although their electronic voting machines are used in the US, most ballots are actually paper ballots. So how the Russians can hack a paper ballot box, I really don't know. I mean, the level of illogic in these allegations is extraordinary.
Okay, let's just go through what Craig Murray's saying again. He says, I know who leaked them. I've met the person who leaked them, and they are certainly not Russian, and it's an insider. It's a leak, not a hack. The two are different things. If what the CIA is saying is true, and the CIA's statement refers to people who are known to be linked to the Russian state, then they would have arrested someone. If it was someone inside the United States, America has not been shy about arresting whistleblowers, and it's not been shy about extraditing hackers. They plainly have no knowledge whatsoever. So the whole thing, it seems, maybe a bit of a sort of just a massive lie.
It's
anyway,
propaganda.
on this BBC 5 Live programme this morning, Emma Barnett's show, she also interviewed a chap called Edward Lucas, who I'd not come across before. Very interesting character. He's one of the editors of The Economist magazine, and he had this to say about Russian money laundering.
The dirty money that flows in such vast quantities out of Russia and into the financial system in both Britain and America and other countries. This is really the biggest vulnerability that the Kremlin's got, that they stash their cash in the Western financial system while preaching anti-Westernism as a sort of political ideology. And they already have taken some steps under what are called the Magnitsky sanctions, which is about relating to a lawyer who died after being very badly treated in Moscow after he'd revealed a huge government money laundering scam. And so we have precedent to do this. Those went through Congress and were actually resisted by the administration. But there's plenty more that could be done about all sorts of financial misbehaviour that the Russians...
Well, it's just more tittle-tattle, isn't it? Magnitsky and Khodorkovsky, for example, who was a great hero in the West. Khodorkovsky was a criminal, as many oligarchs in Russia are, as many oligarchs in this country are. And of course, what they're doing is that the image of Russia in the Yeltsin era, when I used to visit, is being used to blacken the modern Russian state as if it was still a shambles when the IMF were fully in charge of Russia. The IMF are no longer fully in charge of Russia, which is why they're now being accused of being oligarchical thieves, whereas when the oligarchy was thieving, they weren't accused of any of this because their oligarchy were thieving on our behalf.
Anyway, the Economist editor Edward Lucas, he says that the Russians actually are definitely were involved in this interfering in the elections.
Well, how does he know?
It's no secret that the intelligence agencies all over Europe have been worried about Russia for years, and they've found difficulty in getting their political masters to take it seriously.
But when it's interfered with an election like this...
It's happened in other countries before that Russia's interfered in elections, but as I said, it's been very difficult to get the big Western intelligence agencies a real hearing at the top from politicians. That, whether it's Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or David Cameron, the Obama administration, Angela Merkel, lots of the big Western governments have just been unwilling to listen to what their spies were telling them about the extent of Russian mischief-making, meddling and interference all over the place. It's not just in elections, it's also the use of organised crime, sort of propaganda. I think that there's still large chunks of the world that doesn't understand that this is a problem, but I think in Europe, certainly the Germans are now waking up very alertly to this, and they've got elections coming, and they think that the same tactics that were used against Hillary Clinton are going to be used against Angela Merkel.
Right.
And they're really worried about that. So I think there's I sense that our own government is taking this a lot more seriously than they did, but I'm afraid it's still too little and too late as far as I'm concerned.
So why is Edward Lucas saying the same tactics which were used against Hillary Clinton will be used against Angela Merkel, where it looks as if actually what's happened is they've just made it up, the CIA?
Yeah, they have just made it up, and all these people are in an echo chamber. You don't get to be editor of The Economist by treading on toes in the intelligence community. In fact, you get invited to Bilderberg with them, where you cook up your lies about what the Russians are or are not.
Well, it's true. The Economist.
And of course, there's overwhelming evidence that the Western.
Martin, the Economists do go to the Bilderberg meetings. Yes, they do go to the Bilderberg meetings, but they don't actually report on them. They're there effectively to just simply keep an eye on what's going on, so they know what's going on. They're also participating. The Economist, who actually owns it and runs it, it's a funny kind of magazine, and one of the things, it's nice to get hold of an editor because they don't actually have bylines in The Economist, do they? No, they don't, and that's one of the things that annoys me about it as a magazine, because they present what they're saying as if it's some kind of authoritative truth about the way the economy works, but there's no byline of who's written it, and they haven't explained how they came by the information that they're presenting. But of course, the whole point of The Economist is to present this kind of scholarly, semi-scholarly there's a very good reason why. There's a very good reason why you should have a byline, and that is because if you get something wrong, like you did with Roland Dumas, it's very easy to then get hold of the journalist, and or maybe, for example, you may have some very important information to add. Say, for example, if it's about the child abuse scandal. So this is why all journalists need to have a byline, but they're not allowed one at The Economist.
No, well, The Economist is very much part of the establishment. And you know what seems pretty obvious to me is that all the things that the Russians are accused of doing, interfering in elections, oligarchic rip-offs, doping in sport, terrorism, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. And, of course, what we're doing is then accusing them of doing what we're doing.
You mean what our criminal elite are doing. But anyhow, look, he also, Edward Lucas, talked about Putin's hand being directly involved in this supposed hacking of the US elections.
If the FBI had gone in and arrested people in the Trump campaign for being on the Russian payroll, or if the CIA had said, we've got very strong intelligence evidence that Putin is trying to, personally trying to get revenge on Hillary Clinton to get Trump elected, then there would have been people who said, well, why are you interfering in the election campaign? So I think it's very difficult. Intelligence officers don't like being in the political spotlight, and they don't like giving away the sources of what they find out, because that tends to mean you won't be able to find it out again in future. So I think there was a real dilemma for the CIA about how public to be and what to say when. And now they have come out with it, and President Obama has just over 30 days to do whatever it is that he's going to do in the time remaining.
Oh, interestingly enough, the FBI have just said it's a load of nonsense, and they're the ones who actually look into these things, supposedly. I don't believe a word any of these people say, but of course, what is the purpose of all of this, we could ask ourselves. Trump has talked in a more sensible tone of voice about building relationships with Russia, so even if he gets elected on Monday, and he might not be, they will try and box him in so that he can't walk away from a war with Russia, which is what they want.
Also, Edward Lucas talked about the possibility of impeaching Donald Trump.
The president is pretty well entrenched in the American system, and with the Republican Congress, it would be quite hard to see him being impeached, which is the sort of, that was what did for President Nixon, was the prospect of impeachment. We just don't know what the Trump administration is going to be like, and it may be very chaotic. It's already, the popularity ratings aren't great at the moment. It may be mired in unpopularity. It may be very difficult for him to get his things through Congress.
This is about actually whether he should be there electorally, if there was an issue with how he got there. And is there an issue with how he has been elected to office?
Well, I think there is very much an issue. I mean, it looks to me, I think that the evidence that we've had put forward shows that Russia was keep putting a thumb on the scales. Whether that was the decisive factor, we don't know, because Hillary was a terrible candidate and fought a terrible fought a terrible campaign. So there's plenty of other factors as well. And it's theoretically possible that the Electoral College will say, we can't make this man president, and that that is one of the checks and balances of the Constitution. That it's not elected by the popular vote, that there is one further sort of hurdle, which is the Electoral College has to say, go ahead and do this. I think that's pretty unlikely myself. But I think it certainly casts a big cloud over his presidency, and particularly the fact that he's gone to war with the intelligence agencies. And if you publicly dismiss the CIA as a bunch of idiots, they are, he's not receiving his intelligence briefings, he's not taking any notice of what they're telling him, and I think he's cruising for a bruising on that one, because first of all, he actually needs the intelligence in order to function properly as president, and secondly, if he's really unpleasant to them, they have all sorts of ways of making life difficult for him, not least in leaking things.
Well, I'm reminded of John F. Kennedy's favourite quote, which is, "I intend to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces." He didn't last much longer. The CIA are like a vampire squid on the face of humanity.
That's Goldman Sachs, surely.
Yes, well, I think there's not much difference between the two these days, is there? It's like a revolving door. How does the editor of The Economist know what the CIA knows and thinks? That's because he's got chums in the CIA, and of course they're all chums together.
It sounds to me as if
they?
Maybe the London establishment is getting a bit rattled about Donald Trump.
They are. I think that's just, as I said earlier. I think what the purpose of all of this is I don't think they are on Monday. They are not going to. The Electoral College is not going to not make him president, but they're making it difficult for him to make peace with Russia. They're trying to tie his hands so that he's got to stick with the war with Russia line, which is bipartisan in the US and in Britain. Absolutely bonkers. There are serious people in Britain like Michael Heseltine who know it's bonkers.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Now we're getting on to a more domestic issue. Convicted terrorist says MI5 pumped and dumped him. This is in The Guardian yesterday. A Birmingham man gave cash to the man in the hat. The Brussels bombing suspect claims he was recruited by MI5 and then thrown to the wolves. Zakaria Boufasil, 26, said he held several meetings with British intelligence agencies personnel who paid him £3,000 for information and brought him gifts, including Camel cigarettes, a Samsung mobile phone and clothes. I don't know if I would take a Samsung mobile phone or any other mobile phone from MI5. Not that they need to give you one. I'm sure they can get into your phone as it is. Boufasil and Mohammed Ali Ahmed, 27, also of Birmingham, were jailed on Monday this week for handing over £3,000 to Mohammed Abrini at a meeting in Small Heath Park, Birmingham. Abrini earned his nickname Man in the Hat after being spotted on CCTV at Brussels. Well, I wonder if the £3,000 that was handed over was actually the cash from MI5.
Well, quite possibly, although it was also suggested that he defrauded Social Security to get the money. But I think the fact of the matter is that people have got to realise that this guy was working for MI5. Now, that suggests that MI5, just like other intelligence agencies, might have a hand in the Brussels attacks, just as they had a hand in the other attacks that we know have taken place. In other words, when you look closely at this stuff with a proper magnifying glass, it's all rather different from the shouting from the top of the roof.
So why did the judge rule that none of this could be talked about at his case? Because if the jury had known about it, maybe they wouldn't have even convicted him.
Well, like the other chap that was supposedly, by the Westminster police took him to the Old Bailey, said he was going to join a terrorist organisation in Syria, and then he was able to, his lawyers were able to...
So what's our advice for anyone out there that gets approached by MI5 to do something like this, potentially to maybe infiltrate or just to give information to them, where even if they do come bearing gifts, and of course many of us out there don't have a lot of money, we're very tempted to take that money, aren't we?
Well, you'd be a fool if you did, because they're not going to protect you. You are just going to be used in order to create an image of that they want to happen, and then you'll either be dead or you'll end up in prison.
It's almost like a kind of recruiting agency for the stage magazine for the next production.
Yeah, that's right.
Also, France this week prolonged its state of emergency despite concerns over human rights from Amnesty International. 3 times a day at breakfast, lunch and dinner time, Antho Bolamba reports at his local police station in a Paris suburb he can't leave his house at night or France at all. He's been placed after house arrest 4 days after the November 2015 Paris bombing. and shooting attacks as part of a nationwide state of emergency. He says otherwise he'll go to jail, even though they don't have apparently any kind of charges against him. This has been happening for weeks and weeks, and it can only carry on because there's a state of emergency in France. The other thing is this is going to cover all the period up to and after the presidential elections next year.
Indeed, and the purpose of these terrorist attacks, which I believe are being orchestrated within the intelligence services, like the DGSE in France, who set up the Safari Club in the 1980s, which took over the CIA's nefarious role in setting up an international Islamic brigade to fight in Afghanistan.
Well, we talked last week, didn't we, about this whole idea of Gladio C, that actually many of these terrorist attacks in Europe could now be being orchestrated by NATO and by the intelligence agencies in the NATO countries. Now, it looks from this story we just had there that the intelligence agencies certainly are very much involved with these terrorist groups. Now, what they'll say is, we're just infiltrating these groups. At which point does that stop, and at which point do the intelligence agencies start to control those groups?
Well, as I mentioned last week, in the US, virtually everybody who's been convicted of terrorism has been set up by the FBI. Now, you would have thought that if you had a serious terrorist attack threat on, you wouldn't waste time setting up patsies.
Donald Trump is to nominate a friend of the settlement movement as the new US ambassador to Israel. President-elect Donald Trump named David Friedman, a bankruptcy lawyer aligned with the Israeli far right, as his nominee for ambassador to Israel, elevating a campaign advisor who had questioned the need for any two-state solution and has likened left-leaning Jews in America to the Jews who aided the Nazis in the Holocaust.
The Jews who aided the Nazis in the Holocaust, what, like the Zionist Jews that did deals with Hitler, as Ken Livingstone pointed out, and then was jumped on. And incidentally, this anti-Semitism definition that we're going to bring into British law, does that mean that you can't question anything about the state of Israel? Is that what anti-Semitism means? Because that ain't any anti-Semitism in my
Well, that's what the Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis was saying a couple of weeks ago. Also, another appointment, Rex Tillerson, the wild card diplomat. He's the chief of ExxonMobil. He's quite friendly with the Russian energy company, Rosneft, etc., and with Putin, the chief executive of Exxon, to take over as Secretary of State, over from John Kerry.
Well, I mean, Trump looks like he's going to be a disaster, and I think that what they're making sure is that he's not going to be allowed to make peace with Russia. So he can appoint Tillerson, but events, dear boy, events will derail him if he tries to make peace.
Also, all over the news in France this week has been the Britain and the United States tapping into passengers' phones while they're in Air France jets. Lots of other planes too. But why are the NSA and GCHQ targeting the French particularly?
Well, I don't know. You better ask them.
Well, I can tell you why. It's because they are in major power historically in Syria, and they are really not interested in trying to overthrow Assad, it seems, anymore.
Well, no, I think they've actually led the charge. Marine Le Pen probably would be...
well, there's a big election coming up too, isn't there?
Yeah.
And they always do that. I mean, down in Greece, I can remember Vodafone actually was spying on... they were spying on all the Greek politicians in the run-up to the Greeks joining the Euro. So that was a little bit cheeky of them. Anyway, I hope we managed to cover everything I said we were going to. It was a bit of a lot to cover there in the second hour this week. Time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 7 o'clock now. Coming up, Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makawi. Thanks to Martin Foda in the first hour and to Oxford economist Martin Summers. Our show page for your comments and criticisms is thisweek.org.uk. A sister show Dialects on at noon on Tuesday. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. We'll be here all over the Christmas break. And a special show next week. Do please join us for the Politics Show at the same time next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Live from the Sky News Centre.